Hello. Hi, this is Hyun coming back to you to introduce the TEM Expo Webinar 2, talking about managing telecom and network expenses in the time of Corona. This is a challenging time for all of us, and I think there's an interesting opportunity to take a look at telecom and network expenses. It's going to be a connectivity challenge that we continue to have in this remote work time and place. And so we're going to have a quick 20-25 minutes going over some of the key things that you need to be considering over the next few months and over the rest of 2020, specifically in this regard. But, we do this TEM Expo event series, frankly, because we have three key challenges right now: conserving cash, supporting remote workers, protecting the company. There's a lot of things that we need to go over, and I want to make sure that you guys are in tune with the best practices that we've learned in 2000, the best practices we've learned in 2008 and 2009, what we've been thinking about from a digital transformation perspective. Just an interesting note, I actually just got off a call with Workday's executive team where they were talking to a bunch of us analysts about what they're planning to do. And one of the things that Anil Busri, their CEO, brought up that I thought was really interesting was just the idea of having to do things faster, the fact that we need quick payback for the things that we do to make it worthwhile. And one of the pressures they're seeing on their end is that they have, for their projects, they're still going through them as planned, but they're actually finding that their clients are asking, can we configure some of this stuff afterwards, or can we slow down kind of the nitty-gritty of perfecting this actual project? It's more important for us to get this done on time and to start working now. And I think that's going to be a similar pressure that we feel on the IT side as we're thinking about IT management and network and telecom management. So, before I get into this, nowadays, how do we start every meeting? So how's everybody doing? How are you? So I thought I'd go ahead and ask you that as well, since this is where we are now. I'm holding open a poll for you, and if you can go in and look under the slides where you are and just see if you can answer that. I'd love to see how you're doing. Everybody's in a little different place. There's no problem with doing great, doing bad, whatever that might be. I know that personally, it's been a very interesting week. As I said in my first webinar a couple days ago, it's been extremely challenging to figure out what to do next. Everybody wants to know what to do next. Nobody is really sure what they're doing. So I would actually be checking out all the stories I could tell you. I could do a whole separate webinar on some of the craziness that's going on there. But you guys are doing great. That is nice to see. Fantastic. So I'll move on from here, but I'm glad to see that everybody else is holding up well in these interesting times. That said, so I'm going to pull in a bit of a downer as a starting point, not just because to be depressing, but just to be realistic about where we are. Latest unemployment numbers just came in. Another 4.4 million Americans filed for unemployment. 26 million people have filed for unemployment in the last 5 weeks. This is the number that keeps me going, because I think about how to bring these people back as quickly as possible, and that how we, in our humble roles in cost management, sourcing, procurement, can help these get people coming back and to save the jobs that are currently in place right now. Every 100K to 200K that you find, I think of that as basically an FTE. That's basically how I drive the numbers at the end of the day. And I can't make the company use that money, but at least I can do my part to make sure that that money is there in the next quarter, in the next half year, throughout the rest of the year. That was my job when I used to do this for a living, and that's how I always thought about these numbers at the end of the day. These dollars are directly related to the financial flexibility that your company has from a cash management perspective to do the things that really matter. So what can we do to help bring that part of the workforce back? As I said before last time, we should be the business stewards that our firms need. And it's going to be, and this is a key trend that I think is going to happen throughout the rest of 2020, that is the basis for the rest of this presentation. Basically, networking and telecom spend are expected to remain flat in 2020. If you had asked me 3 months ago, I would have said there was going to be a 3 to 4% increase in spend, just because it went along with IT trends and cloud and everything else that was happening. But obviously, people are cutting back on spend, but nobody wants to spend more money. At the same time, we have these remote support issues that have come up in place that are increasing costs, and we have all this bandwidth going into corporate headquarters where nobody's actually going into work at the same time. So there's going to be some interesting reallocation that happens here. Companies that reallocate correctly are going to probably cut costs and support their employees. Companies that don't are going to be pouring a lot of money into resources that aren't being used. So, just to let you know, I'm the presenter. Most important thing here is that just to let you know that I'm coming from this from a perspective of having done this for 20 years. I've been very focused on IT costs, telecom costs, sourcing issues, billing issues, inventory and invoice issues, and how to translate into greater business value. The details, you don't care about the details. You want to know what to actually do over the rest of the year. So let's get into that. So in the last webinar, I presented these 6 stages of managing COVID IT, going from shadow IT to securing your business, auditing your environment, training and celebrating, standardizing and improving, and then transforming the business. What does that mean from a practical perspective for telecom and network expenses? What it really means is we're going to start looking at what happened over the past month from a networking perspective. Here are 4 key things to keep in mind. First of all, consumer-grade equipment and security are now normal. Everything that you may have set up from a corporate perspective to create high-performing networks and well-governed networks and secure networks, a lot of that goes out the window now that you are now dependent on a home connection for everything that you're doing. And not only that, but that second point, wired and wireless connectivity are increasingly interchangeable. You don't even know whether you're dealing with a landline, a cable connection, or MiFi or Wi-Fi. You don't know exactly where the connection's coming from or how secure that connection actually is. So this is going to be a trade-off in thinking about, is this a circuit? Is this a phone? Is this how are we actually doing this connectivity? And what are the cost benefits of doing this each way? The third piece is around new apps becoming more important. Obviously, we have all been seeing how conferencing solutions now are the way that we all do work. But behind that, what does conferencing really mean? You're often using both voice and video going over a digital network. That's a lot of bandwidth to start using, especially if you have no standards for what kind of voice or video to use, if you have bad equipment that requires where, frankly, the quality of voice and video being sent over doesn't even match what your equipment can actually provide. So you might have a crappy camera, but you're still using 1080p video and using a lot of bandwidth that way. Just little things that are showing up and starting to affect how we purchase, how our bandwidth is being used. And then, on the right side here, you see number 4, corporate bandwidth investments may be lying fallow. So this is the mess that we've created in the shadow IT version of how to get to work, over the past month. This is something that needs to get cleaned up. So to figure that out, assume that your network strategy needs to be configured. Here are kind of 6 options, 6 ideas of what to do next. Discover employees' primary connectivity option, how they're actually using networking at this point. Second, moving to the right, reconfiguring network access management. You're thinking about how, especially if you've invested in SD-WAN, software-defined networks over the past couple of years, you have a lot of flexibility in how you're going to optimize your network resources, but you need to make sure that you are configured to bring your bandwidth to the right places at the right times. Third, to the right, figure out what security is needed to make sure that your networks aren't going to get hacked and that all the bandwidth that you're using is for business purposes or related purposes. Moving to the bottom left, you're going to have to look at labor laws for employee reimbursement if you're depending on people using their home connectivity right now. This is an issue that came up a lot in the mobility world a few years ago when in California we saw a lawsuit called Cochran versus Schwann that determined that employees need to be reimbursed for all expenses that are relevant to their work. Well, home network is a part of that as well. And you might be seeing a lot of expenses come in over the next month or so that have not traditionally come in. You need to see what you're responsible for and see what your policy is there. Fifth is seeing which apps are in place and which apps are driving your bandwidth needs. This is probably going to look different in a remote world than it did in a corporate world. Just because you need to look up more stuff, you can't just ask the person next to you what's going on. And there's going to be challenges there. And then finally, on the bottom right-hand side, you can see learn what you're competing against. From a network perspective, think about that from a home perspective. If you're dealing with a home network, sure, you're using it for work, but you're also competing against your kids who are also using the network for work, for school, and doing whatever they're doing from an educational perspective. You might be competing against your partner who is also doing work on their network. And knowing what kind of demand that network, your home networks are dealing with, is going to be important in understanding how to right size these network elements, as well as figure out whether you need to make additional investment either from an equipment or a bandwidth perspective. So that's where we need to start. So stage 2, securing your business. Obviously, with us moving from work to home, the consumer grade equipment is a huge gap here. Are your home computers and home tablets and home phones and home networks and home equipment all secured to the extent that you want? Can you actually prioritize what you're looking at? This means you need to take a look at what's happening there. And then again, the second point, going back to what I just said before, considering your employees' kids and parents from a networking perspective. Now they are also security issues if we are using the same network. Anything they do that is stupid now becomes your potential problem. We saw this a lot with the Zoom bombing issues that have recently occurred. As everybody started using Zoom, it's not necessarily that Zoom can't be secured, but people weren't securing their Zoom accounts, using them on a consumer basis, and finding that they were easily bombable and hackable. Zoom has its own issues, but a lot of these issues that were coming up were simply not using your passwords correctly or exposing account information that just didn't need to be exposed. And now not only are the employees you're supporting potential challenges, but anybody who are also using those accounts for any sort of reason, whether that be Zoom or Google Meet or WebEx or whatever it might be. And then third, reviewing your strategy and figuring out whether corporate assets are at risk in a remote work world. This requires a different thought process, and it's going to depend on how your company is actually supporting employees at this time. A third stage, you need to audit your environment. Now, this is a really big challenge right now. The first point here I cannot emphasize enough. Benchmark your March and April spend. And figure out where that spend is coming from, chasing down that new account expenses and services. Those 2 points are going to be extremely important because a lot of your remote spend is probably not going to be formally managed at this point. There is going to be a lot of stuff sneaking in over the next month. If you're in IT expense management right now, you need to work closely with your corporate expense team And you need to treat this like a bring your own device situation. Now all of IT is bring your own IT. Start with that assumption, chase it down. This is going to be extremely important because benchmarking what your true IT spend is and which vendors are really being used and understanding the breadth of bandwidth and networking capabilities that you need to support is going to be absolutely crucial to your expense management over the rest of the year, as well as any sort of contract negotiations and changes that you are making over the course of this year. If you're not benchmarking your March and April spend and chasing down everything right now, you are going to be behind when it comes to managing the rest of 2020 and possibly beyond in terms of managing this new normal of IT spend. And when I mean new normal, I don't just mean us being locked up here in quarantines, but even afterwards, we're going to have more remote workers afterwards than we currently had 3 months ago. And to be able to manage IT correctly, you need to benchmark the spend, chase down the accounts, and deal with this from an expense management perspective. This third point here about reconsidering geographic focus and access portfolio. Geographic focus, it was easy to say that these specific areas were most important from a networking perspective because they were your headquarters. They had the greatest density of employees. With us being spread out to the 4 winds, that may not necessarily be the case. Take a look at how your networking behavior and activity is going and make sure that you reroute accordingly. And then consider that access portfolio. So this goes back to what I said before about wired and wireless solutions being increasingly interchangeable from a home perspective. You wouldn't necessarily be able to support an entire headquarters, 3,000 person headquarters on a wireless connection. But obviously, if we're doing this all in onesie twosies at home, it's a very different environment. So reconsider how that network access portfolio needs to be supported as you're auditing and keep track of that as you're auditing your environment. Next stage, train and celebrate. So I got a couple questions after the webinar, my last webinar on Tuesday. Why are we doing this fluffy training and celebrating? But at the end of the day, I think this is important not just from a human perspective, but also from having IT being seen as a strategic enabler, working with HR, working on creating a better environment for working rather than simply being pigeonholed as an invoice processor or a contract sourcer. There's more information that exists that you can start using and digging into, such as figuring out which employees are being cost efficient, identifying the new and different use cases for supporting bandwidth and that are driving the need for additional bandwidth. Looking at bottom left, setting up a presentation with key stakeholders, and then on the bottom right, teaching the company. To get a little more detail here, let's take a look at each of these points. So when you're thinking about finding out which employees are being cost efficient, this is a time to chase down application, equipment, and connectivity usage, trying to add up what is happening on a cost center by cost center level if possible, and then noticing which ones may be more effective or less effective from a per employee basis, and figuring out whether that's just because certain employees are using bandwidth more accurately, or whether this is because some people are not using remote services correctly. There's an opportunity to really dig into what's going on here. And you can also figure out which employees are able to use corporate assets more correctly, whether it be virtual desktops or remote access, or being able to use corporate networking while remaining at home to drive the majority of bandwidth needs. And then balancing work and home usage. Maybe there are certain people who have figured out how to better balance home usage and work usage and have lower bandwidth with needs as a result, or are able to simply trade off times with other bandwidth intensive use cases that exist within the home. It's important to start chasing down how employees are being cost efficient. And then avoiding overages. It's important to figure out which employees are maxing out their MiFi connectivity or their cell phone connectivity, or doing things that are really not cost effective because they're trying to stay at work. And as if there are any trends to that, whether perhaps there are specific departments or specific geographies where these types of overages are happening more often, and enable them proactively to make sure that they don't keep racking these up month after month for the rest of the year. Next, looking at new and different use cases, we've talked about some of these trade-offs already, just to emphasize that it's important to find these use cases. Next, looking at setting up a presentation with key stakeholders. So after we're benchmarking in March and April, important to get in front of people and let them know what this new remote work environment looks like. Quite frankly, it's still just a bit early to do it. You want to take a good look at these March and April usage and invoice patterns to really know what's going on. But once you do that, it's important to get executive direction and point out what is going on, point out what's happening from a financial perspective and operational perspective, and show that you're on top of this. That's going to be really important in showing the value that you're providing, and for you to be able to provide guidance over the rest of the year on what is happening from an invoice perspective, an inventory perspective, a user perspective. And even if you feel like you're relatively low level in this regard, you still have access to a lot of information, either if you're processing the invoices and looking at how line items are changing from a month-to-month basis, or if you're looking at expense reports and seeing sudden changes, or if you're looking at contracts and are starting to look at how those terms are relate to the actual usage that is going on. But this is the time to prepare. Get ready for this May presentation. And then finally, teach the company. You know, this is an ongoing opportunity to translate all of the best practices that you're starting to find, or all of the strange anomalies that you're starting to find, and then let people know that these exist. People want to be proactive. People want to work with you on being cost efficient, but with the new rules that are coming into place last month and this month, nobody knows what the real rules for doing a better job are and being more responsible are in this new normal, especially in your organization, which is obviously going to have its own specific issues and challenges compared to everyone else. This is not a one-size-fits-all opportunity. This is going to be dependent on what you find within your organization. So next up, there's this opportunity to standardize and improve. And from my perspective, I think a lot of this comes from both sourcing and selective vendor and selecting vendors correctly. So starting on this gray row, start looking at adding vendors based on employee need. You're going to find in your expense report that there are specific vendors that are starting to do stuff that you may not, are starting to come in that you may not have expected, or you may not have a strong corporate relationships with. This is a time to align your sourcing to your actual usage. Moving to the right, codifying corporate settings and best practices. This is more of a governance perspective, but just a lot of the things that I mentioned before from a conferencing perspective that have been muddying up the waters. Make sure that all of your apps and conferencing capabilities and contact center, unified communications are all locked down so that people don't have to worry about whether they're breaking something or not, simply to do their work correctly. Moving to the right again, on contract negotiations, you probably have minimum annual revenue commitments, discounts that may or may not be relevant in this new world. You definitely want to review those and see if there are any products that may have been underrepresented from a discounting perspective that you may want to address more aggressively in your new renewals, as well as thinking about migrating services. What happens when you migrate XYZ, and how does that affect the amount of money that you're spending? How is your minimum commitment limited or structured at this point? And is there some way to be able to work around that given the significant changes that have happened in your networking solutions? And then on the blue side, we can see optimizing based on access, portfolio, and app usage, as well as aligning telecom and network services to a future state. So in our last webinar, we talked about how CFOs will probably be driving for an additional 10% of employees to be working from home going forward. Make sure you're prepared for that. So you're not just making a short-term change to deal with the 40% of employees who are at home now, but to understand that probably a quarter of those who went home for the long haul may not be coming back into the office, and that you'll be able to support them correctly. And then stage 6, transforming the business. I think there's a lot of opportunities to actually improve the way that we support networking. So just thinking about that from a practical perspective, being able to left to right, being able to augment the network more quickly. In the middle gray part, defining and pre-qualifying vendors, especially for dealing with last mile issues and understanding how to improve remote support. And then on the right side, thinking about integrated procure to pay. When you think about networking services today, it's still very difficult to go from sourcing all the way to a contract, to invoice processing, to payment, to dispute, and having all of that supported in a single solution. We still see that as a very fragmented environment here at Amalgam Insights. When we're consulting companies, one of the things that comes up most often from a networking perspective is simply, how do I make sure that I'm managing our network spend correctly? So I think there's a real opportunity for companies to get in front of this and start working more closely with vendors that are able to integrate that entire procure to pay life cycle and value chain. And then on the bottom row here, you can see applications and network alignment. In a software-defined world, obviously, software-defined networks allow you to do a lot more alignment between your network and your key workloads. And as your workloads change, you want to make sure that you're able to go back and forth and be able to align your networks to the applications that really matter. The fifth one around wireless trade-offs, obviously that refers to the emergence of 5G and Wi-Fi 6 that are coming up, as well as any other wireless connections that may happen from a primary networking perspective. It's going to be important to think about that in terms of your WAN instead of simply having your landline network and your wireless network be two separate things. These two areas are coming together, and it's important to keep that in mind. And then in the bottom right here, non-traditional apps. So I've brought up conferencing already, but I think also unified communications applications, collaboration, contact center, there's support, customer support. You know, there are a lot of applications that are going to require a lot of bandwidth that are not necessarily well reflected, either because they have had poor adoption in a more corporate centered environment, or because companies simply haven't fully measured the impact that March and April are having on their new network behavior. So these are a few things to keep in mind from 2020 perspective. This is a preview for previously covering this topic in greater detail at the TEM Expo 2020. This is going to be a virtual event that we're holding on June 11th, which is going to go over this topic as well as many others around IT expense management, looking across cloud, software as a service, mobility, network, Internet of Things, as well as tactics around invoice and payment processing, disputing, contract negotiations. If you want more information, please get in touch with us. Thank you so much for your time today. And if you like this, and please let your team know, please share this. There will be a recording available afterwards at this link as well. So thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to the next webinar. Take care.